Beliefs about vampires, werewolves, witches, and wizards are widespread.
Exactly what is a serial killer?
Our house was 2 rooms, and there was 7 of us.
He held the bat like this.
That's why I have characters who sort of expose themselves.
And everybody always say, Coach Carter, Samuel Jackson is taller than you. I said, I know, but I think I'm better looking.
Before I begin, I just want to thank Southeastern, Dean Karen Fontenot and Provost Tina Golding for the support. Much of what I'll be talking about today was written while I was on sabbatical in London, and so I want to thank everyone for that. And I also want to thank my students. I see some of them here. As many of you know, I've been trying out a lot of this stuff in the classroom. Some of it, there's a certain Bell bingo card, as you know. The certain examples that I bring up again and again, which has helped me to fine-tune a lot of what ultimately ends up in my books. So there's a lot of repetition in the classroom, but that's actually kind of a theme that I want to start with today, this notion of repetition. And if you look behind me, can you all see that fairly well enough? That's one of the water lily paintings that Monet painted. I think that was one of the later paintings that he did. Some of you may know, I didn't know until I was doing some research recently, that when Monet's family bought the property at Giverny and he built a water pond, it was like in the late 1890s he painted his first water lily painting, and for the next 3 decades he painted 250 more. So he kept going back again and again and again to the pond to paint the water lilies over again and again. So I mean, on one hand, you could look at that and say, well, that's creative. He didn't have much else going on, so he just did the same thing over and over again. But what I will argue, and that's one of the things I want to talk about today, is that there's something going on in artistic practice that brings people back to the same thing over again and again and again. And I will also claim, which is where I come in with my own work, that philosophy has something similar at work when it is doing its own work. And that's kind of brings me to something I wrote, I guess 7 years ago now, on Deleuze and Guattari's book, What is Philosophy? And I've kind of been going back to that question ever since. It's one of those questions that, I mean, an engineer doesn't sit and go, what is an engineer? What is engineering? They seem to be more focused on what the problems that engineering are dealing with and so on. But philosophy, interestingly, and some of the other humanities might also ask the question, what is philosophy? And one of the things I'm going to talk about, one of the things I've been doing in my most recent work is focusing on the relationship between philosophy and science, because I think that's one of the more natural ways we have of thinking about what philosophy is, because we can kind of wrap our minds around science. I did some of that in this book, but I've been continually going back to that question again and again. So that's kind of going to be the theme today. What is the relationship between philosophy and science, philosophy and art, philosophy and politics, philosophy and practice? A bunch of those themes are all going to be kind of coming in together in my talk today. So what will I be talking about today? There's another Monet painting, number 2 out of 250. And that's one of the early ones. And so what I want to talk about today in the first part of my talk, I want to talk about the relationship between philosophy and science. What's often seen as their similarity, what the difference is, and so on. And what I'm going to focus on is what I see are the key differences between the two. After I kind of lay that out, I will focus on the aspect that I think is important to philosophy itself, what I call relevance questions, something I'll explain a little bit later. Then after that, I will turn to one of the ways I think that's very important to us in making sense of our own lives. It's the role that narratives play in making sense of who we are, what our values, purposes are, why we're here, and so on. And that will also tie in to the sort of political questions. And we even have as a kind of term, the political narrative. Who controls the political narrative? So narratives, I think, are very important in many aspects of our lives, and so I'll focus on that. And then deal with some of the partisanship we see in politics, which will lead me to the final section today, is what role does philosophy have as a kind of practice and discipline to help us think through some of these issues that are going on in society. So the first part of the talk will kind of set the stage eventually for what I'll be talking about at the end. So to begin, as many of you know, though you probably wouldn't know if you were one of my classes, much of my work has been on the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. And I don't really teach him in my classes because he's insanely hard to read. He has written very, very dense texts that presuppose much of the history of philosophy, right? So unless you have been a student of much of the history of philosophy, you're going to be quickly overwhelmed once you read some of his texts. But one of the things that I think is very important to Deleuze is this concept of repetition. You see it in the title of this, which is often considered his masterpiece work, his most important philosophical text, Difference and Repetition. On the very first page of that book, he says this about repetition. So I'll read the quote that's just behind me. "This is the apparent paradox of festivals. They repeat an unrepeatable. They do not add a second and a third time to the first, but carry the first time to the nth power. It is not Federation Day, which commemorates or represents the fall of the Bastille, but the fall of the Bastille, which celebrates and repeats in advance all the Federation Days, or Monet's first water lily repeats all the others." So there's a kind of a distinction here. Obviously, this is page 1, so Deleuze goes on for many, many pages to kind of further elaborate what's going on here. But so, for instance, a wedding anniversary. So a wedding anniversary, the day you get married, that day sort of imminently sort of contains the reason for all the repetitions, the celebrations later on. The first water lily painting, that's why I began with that example. The very first water lily painting that Monet painted contains within it the motivation or the impulse to keep going back, right? There's a sort of, the term I use in one of my books is there's a kind of problem imminent to what a painter's trying to do that is never exhausted by each time they go out and paint whatever it is they're painting. So they can keep going back to it. Now, we probably have some experience of that when we have a song we're obsessed with. We keep playing it over and over and over again, and maybe hear different things in it each time we play it. So there is this sort of something to the artwork, to festivals, to events that make what Deleuze calls an external repetition possible. So take the Monet. The very first Monet painting has some sort of problem, some sort of insight, some sort of imminent thing going on, what Deleuze will call an internal repetition, that makes possible all the 250 times that Monet went back to paint more and more paintings. So that's kind of the distinction I want to start with. I'm going to elaborate it a lot more today, so if I've gone a little too quick, don't worry. That's the main gist of what I want to talk about. And I think that's also where talking about the relationship between philosophy and science becomes most critical, because in science as well, repetition is an important feature, right? Repetition is kind of built in to the scientific method. So to understand how philosophy is different from science, I think entails looking at these different forms of repetition. And that's what I do in these two books. These are the books that were published at the end of last year. Particularly, you probably can't see that. This is like a 10 by 30 painting. By 10 by 30, I mean 10 feet by 30 feet. Anselm Kiefer, he's a great contemporary artist. So in these two books that I've been working on, I begin with what's often taken, what I take to be kind of the consensus view on the relationship between philosophy and science, as expressed by Bertrand Russell here in this quote. And Russell says, "As soon as definite knowledge concerning any subject becomes possible, this subject ceases to be called philosophy and becomes a separate science." So this is what you could call the midwife theory of philosophy, right? Philosophy kind of plays a kind of midwife to the sciences. So it asks questions. So a good example would be psychology. Psychology as a sort of discipline was sort of grouped under, I don't know, philosophy of soul, philosophy of ethics, moral philosophy, theology. But it wasn't really a science until in the 19th century you began to get quantitative empirical studies that began to be replicable, right? You could repeat these studies and make some claims that then others could go out and repeat, and then you go, aha, there's something there. Once that happens, then it becomes a separate science. So the idea here is that philosophy is a kind of, it asks the questions, and that's all good and well, but ultimately what we really want is science, right? So that's I think, the midwife view. An extreme version of this view can be found in Stephen Hawking, when he said in one of his last books, philosophy is dead. Philosophy is not kept up with modern developments in physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. So what I argue in these two books is that people like Hawking aren't wrong with respect to what science is doing, but they are wrong with respect to what philosophy is doing. Right? Philosophy is asking different questions than what science is asking. And I will also argue that philosophy is doing more than just asking the questions that may give rise to a science down the road. Like philosophy has a sort of a different, it's playing a different game, so to speak. One of the figures that have been kind of influential in my own thoughts about this question of the relationship between philosophy and science, and it's somewhat ironic that he is Ludwig Wittgenstein. And the reason it's ironic is because Wittgenstein is often held up, especially in his first book, the Tractatus, as kind of the hero of analytic philosophy. Right? He was a student of Bertrand Russell's, and he didn't really have to do coursework. He just wrote this Tractatus. Everyone thought it was genius, and they just gave him a Ph.D. and said, here, take it. And he went and ran with it. So he is kind of considered one of those sort of eccentric geniuses. But in the Tractatus, interestingly, he says the whole sense, he says this at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book. He says the whole sense of the book might be summed up in the following words. What can be said at all can be said clearly, and what we cannot talk about, we must pass over in silence. So most people focus on the what can be said clearly part, and it's often taken to mean, like in analytic philosophy, if you use logic and you use sort of empirical, verifiable concepts and terms and so on, then if you can't do that, then just it's pseudo problems, it's to be ignored. But I think even Wittgenstein was aware that what is passed over in silence may actually be the most important stuff, right? What's passed over in silence. So what is this that's passed over in silence? Now, one of the things that I think is important for Wittgenstein, this is kind of where I'm going in the next part of my talk, is that what we do in our lives with language and other things is we follow rules. And whenever we try to set forth what our rules are, we kind of hit into problems. I think that's the insight I think that Wittgenstein had. So I want to focus for a few minutes on this notion of rule following. Some of you have had me in classes. Anyone recognize what that is? Oh, yes. Yes. Did you really know that, or is it just because you were in my class? Yes. So one of my favorite examples is that if you know what a gardenia is, you can go up to a bush and say, there's a gardenia. And so I'll give the example if my wife, and she's here, it tells me to water the gardenias, but I go out and water all the bushes, that means I don't know what a gardenia is. Right? So there's a sense in which if you know a concept, that you can then follow it like a rule. That's like a rule to a game. Right? If you know what the pawn does in chess, then every move you do will be following the rules that pawns do. If you know what a gardenia is, then whenever you come across a bush that's a gardenia, you'll correctly identify it as a gardenia. So there's this idea of rules as very crucial to how we think, right? The way we think is a matter of kind of using concepts to categorize and make sense of our world. What are concepts? One theory of concepts is that they are basically rules. Okay. That's going to be the largely analytic approach to thinking about concepts and thinking about thinking. And it's also going to be very crucial to science as well. Some of you might remember the whole controversy, excitement about LK99. That was the substance that this lab in South Korea claimed was a superconductor. And so for, I don't know, about 2 weeks, there was all the rage about, how will the world change if we actually have a room temperature semiconductor, or superconductor? Because superconductors, they do have them, but they have to be at like super cold temperatures in order to work. But here they had claimed to have created a superconductor that worked at room temperature. So it would have been, done wonders to technology and and energy production, all sorts of things. Well, we don't hear about it anymore. Guess what happened? They tried to repeat the experiments that the lab said that they did, and they didn't get the same results. So crucial to science is indeed a form of repetition, right? The lab gives you a recipe book. Follow these steps to create this substance, and this is what it will be able to do. If it's a superconductor, it will do superconductor type things. They did that, and they didn't get those results, the other labs. And so now it's in the dustbin of failed scientific claims. I remember back when I was in college, there was a claim about fusion, room temperature fusion. That's another form of energy where if you can, it's like the sun, but it requires super high temperatures, and they claim, oh, we did it at room temperature. None of the labs were able to repeat those experiments, and so it ended up being, again, put into the dustbin of claims that have now been rejected. So these are all forms, to go back to my earlier term, of what Deleuze would call external repetition. Right? You're repeating the same thing in an external, visible, determinate way that others can see, observe, measure, and so on and so forth. So there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, Deleuze is he often calls upon science, he often cites science, and science is certainly an important way we have of making sense of the world. But it's limited. And that brings me back to Wittgenstein again, because Wittgenstein was aware that in our use of language, it's more like a game, and it becomes hard to figure out when we are following one rule as opposed to another. So imagine, again, one of the examples I've used in class, so somebody will probably recognize it, the case of sarcasm. Okay? If there was a time, I won't tell the whole story, some have heard it before, I was on an archaeology dig in the middle of France, and I was the only English-speaking person. And one of the guys there, he was really full of himself and so on. And he was like, I found out I was from California. He was like, you know what? Hotel California is my all-time favorite song. And I was like, oh, okay, all right. And you know what? He said, I know what that weird lyric means. Which one? You can check out, but you can never leave. So I'd never given much thought to what that lyric meant. And so I was like, okay, well, what does it mean? It means he forgot his keys. And I, in an attempt to be sarcastic, said, good, very good. Completely missed the sarcasm. So to this day, he's probably walking around thinking that a Californian gave him the seal of approval to his interpretation of that song. So what's happening there? What Wittgenstein would claim is that sarcasm is a form of language game. There's that you either get it or you don't. And when it comes to trying to explain when does it become sarcasm, you could say that there's a kind of tone of voice, there's a certain way that you use things, maybe certain expressions and so on. Those are, again, external forms of trying to validate what it is that makes sarcasm sarcasm. But at the end, Wittgenstein recognized that that is limited. You can't completely be successful in identifying what makes one language game what it is. At the end of the day, according to Wittgenstein, it's just what we do. He calls it our form of life. It's just kind of what we do. And he says, my spade is turned, right? There's no more, you've reached bedrock at that point. Now, what I argue in my books is that we can know more than that, that we can seek more explanations. And that's what I think is the importance of Deleuze's philosophy, is I think he offers us a way to kind of begin to think about some of these issues. And that brings me back to art, because I think art also brings up some of the relationships between rules, rule following, and artistic practice. Right? If we think about artistic practice, there are a lot of rules. I teach a philosophy of art class here, and I often get art majors, and they will often tell me how, yes, it is important that there are certain rules, there's certain techniques, there's certain procedures, certain ways to do things, and a large part of the training is to learn that. But ultimately, if you're going to be a creative artist, you have to break those rules. But you can't just be arbitrary in breaking those rules either. There's a certain way in which you need to break those rules. That's the struggle with art. And that struggle interested Deleuze, both in Monet, but in another painter that he wrote a whole book on, a painter named Francis Bacon. That's a triptych that Francis Bacon did in 1970. And as you can see, it's not an ordinary painting. Just wait till I get to the next one. It's not an ordinary painting. And what Bacon said is that you can go to any art school and find a dime a dozen someone who could do an accurate figurative painting. By figurative painting, you mean someone who can accurately represent the model that's there before you. Right? That's a kind of repetition, an external repetition, right? You take the model that's there before you, you repeat it in a way that resembles what's there on whether the medium is sculpture or painting or drawing and so on. Now for Bacon, that's easy. Anyone can do it. Now that's him talking. If you looked at my drawings, you would go, you can't draw, which is true. I'm kind of working on that, but I could just say I was trying to be Francis Bacon, right, when I do my drawings. But anyways, Bacon, what he's trying to do is he's trying to make the paint speak directly to the people who watch or see their paintings, right? What he is worried about is that painting too quickly becomes a story. You see the figure on the painting, and you try to figure out what the story is going on, who it is, what it's about, and so on and so forth. So Bacon would often do studies, again, repetitively like Monet, and he would come to the subject again and again. And one of his favorite painters was Diego Velázquez. And one of his favorite paintings was Diego Velázquez's 1650 painting of Pope Innocent X, which many art historians claim is one of the greatest paintings, greatest portraits ever done. Bacon did his own version of that painting. So the one on the left is the Diego Velázquez painting of 1650, and the one on the right is the Francis Bacon one of 1953, I think. Obviously, you can tell that the second one is based on the first one, and but there's something somewhat terrifying about the second one. Is he screaming? What's going on? And Bacon was asked about that. He was like, "Are you trying to make your paintings horrific?" He's like, "No, I'm just trying to make it something that you're suddenly it speaks to you. It's like a shock. It's sort of something that sort of kind of hits you." Without you wondering what it's about, right? It tries to hit you below the sort of the level of representational consciousness, which is again one of the themes that was important in Deleuze's work, which is I think one of the reasons he was interested in Bacon's paintings, is that Deleuze's whole philosophy was often a critique of representational thought. Representational thought means in terms of a concept that represents a determinate thing, like a rule. The external rules. He was more interested in the things that cannot be represented, and yet are very important and powerful nonetheless. This leads me to one of the philosophers who I think had a sense of this in his own work. Nietzsche is often famous for some of his more controversial claims, but I think one of the things that's important about Nietzsche is his theory of knowledge. Where knowledge comes from. And in this quote from one of his important books, he says, "And isn't our need for knowledge precisely this need for the familiar, the will to uncover among everything strange, unusual, and doubtful, something which no longer unsettles us? Is it not the instinct of fear that bids us to know?" If you go back to the Bacon painting, Bacon version of Innocent X seems like the Pope is terrified, fearful. And I think I don't think he's intending to be fearful, but I think he is intending to paint something that's below the familiar, right? He's trying to do something that certainly taps into what might provoke fear. As Nietzsche was saying, that's what motivates our desire to know is fear. Is it not the instinct of fear that bids us to know? And I think that is, in many ways, before we even did science, we were long trying to make sense of the world in the context of things that were very unfamiliar and unknown. And I think that process is still with us in everyday life. And one of the things I think that is important to think about is how we go about doing that and what does it entail. And that leads me to the next part of my talk, what I claim is the type of questions that philosophy asks. I call them relevance questions. I contrast relevance questions with truth questions. So a truth question is basically the kind of question science asks. What is it? What's it made of? What's it do? How does it work? And so on and so forth, all those types of questions. A relevance question is more of a question of meaning and significance. And those types of questions aren't easily answered by science. I mean, in a nutshell, and this is why my second book's called Critical Existentialism, because there is a kind of existential theme in that work. And if you think about existentialism and people like Albert Camus, he wrote The Myth of Sisyphus. Some of you might recognize that image of Sisyphus rolling the stone up the hill just for it to roll back down every time it got to the top. So the point then is, there is no point, right? This is sort of absurd. You're being told you need to roll the stone up the hill, and your why, it's just going to roll right back down again. It's not going to accomplish anything. And I think the point for Camus and a number of the other existentialists is that there is something about life and living that is not captured by the types of questions that science asks and answers. Right? There's something to life and the significance of life. There's a relevance and meaning to our life that science sort of sidesteps. It's helpful. Once we've kind of got something that's meaningful and important to us, then we bring science into the picture as a way of furthering that goal that's now been stated and objectified. But there are times when it doesn't work. And in this same essay, the Myth of Sisyphus essay, Camus gives the example about an apartment manager whose daughter had died. And 5 years after his daughter had died, he committed suicide. And this is also on the heels of Camus having said, suicide is the most important philosophical problem. And you're like, whoa, why? And what Camus says is that people who had witnessed and seen that apartment manager had seen that he had changed greatly. That experience, his daughter's death, had undermined him. A more exact word cannot be imagined. Beginning to think is beginning to be undermined. So what is this beginning to think? I mean, one can imagine, why did this happen? Right? And one can look at certain determinate facts to try to answer it, but those wouldn't really answer it, right? I mean, it's not like he didn't know what happened, let's say, right? Even if you had like a news reporter's complete listing of the facts of what happened, it would still leave the questions why, the meaning or significance of it all, the relevance of things. And that's where it becomes, and this is the point that I'm arguing, that science can never adequately answer relevance questions. Right? Science is doing something different, that in terms of relevance questions, we are never completely able to answer them by science. And yet, they are crucially important to us in our lives. And that's where I get to, how do we use these relevance questions? How do they come to manifest themselves in our lives? And that's where I claim that the role of narratives as a part of a process of making sense of our lives comes into play. Now, I did a Google search for family dinner and came up with Ozzie and Harriet, which is kind of appropriate. And why? Well, there's a famous sociologist, Harold Garfinkel, who did a number of studies in the 60s. He was actually influenced by Wittgenstein as well. And one of the things he had his grad students do is go home from school, like imagine over Thanksgiving, they'd go home and hang around the table, but act differently than they usually acted. So, you know, there's all these family dynamics that we have. Someone's the talker, someone's the quiet one, someone's, so we've got these sorts of dynamics. And so he had them intentionally disrupt those expectations. So the quiet one would suddenly start talking a lot, or the talkative one wouldn't talk much. Well, guess what happened? People were like, why are you so talkative tonight? Or, oh, the cat gets your tongue or something, those sorts of things. In other words, there's a kind of reciprocal reinforcement of our behaviors that kind of builds into our sense of who we are, right? It kind of establishes a kind of pattern of who we are, the type of person we are. So it's a kind of narrative that kind of forms the foundation for what we make ourselves to be, what are the types of things that we do, etc. Are you a good public speaker or not? Those are the kinds of things that you will end up having as part of your your narrative. He did all kinds of interesting studies. He would have give things like, oh, I'm sick of that professor. Well, actually, I'm going to go into that in a second anyways. Sick of that professor, and the person would go, what, are you physically ill? Do I need to take you to the emergency room? And people would just get mad, right? People would go like, you know what I meant, and so on and so forth. So the point is that a lot of our interactions with people don't really presuppose a lot of ambiguity, presuppose just a kind of amorphous sort of, this is how we do things, don't question it, okay? And narratives kind of fit into that pattern of making sense of things, but we don't really question them. It just sort of becomes a kind of unconscious sort of pattern. Which leads me to my next example, which I accidentally brought up early. Arlie Hochschild is a sociologist from Berkeley, and she spent 5 years living in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Okay. So as you might imagine, being a sociology professor from Berkeley and living not too far from the Dow chemical plants in Lake Charles, Louisiana, there was they were somewhat different politically in terms of, but she went with the intention of truly trying to understand people's political views and where people get their political views, why they are committed to these views, how they play out in daily life, even when, and this was the important factor, even when facts seem to undermine those views, right? Because one of the questions was, and this is true of everyone, she comes to conclude, that we all have a kind of what she calls a deep narrative that guides our expectations and values of the world, and we are very resistant to modify or change that deep narrative, even when there are facts that would tell us things are otherwise than what our narrative would have us believe. So so the example she found when she was in Lake Charles, this was like 2015, maybe 2016, is that the deep narrative is that most of them are white working class, and their narrative is that they have been working hard, following the rules, and their belief was that if you worked hard, followed the rules, then you would end up achieving the American dream. And it was kind of like you were in line. You just had to wait your turn in line. But if you followed the rules, worked hard, eventually your turn would come. But, this is the deep narrative she claimed, that people don't actually explicitly state to themselves, but kind of is sort of almost unconscious under the surface, an internal repetition, to kind of get back to that idea. But, as the deep narrative continues, there are liberal policies, liberal politicians that allow people to cut in line. And through immigration, affirmative action quotas, and so on and so forth, it allows other people to cut in line. And politicians were actually speaking to those grievances and so on and so forth. So these politicians who speak to that are tapping into this sort of deep narrative. She came up with this deep narrative after living with them for 5 years and spoke with them, and they were like, yeah, that's right, that's right. But the question is, and there's been a lot of studies on this, the question about this, though, is that how can we change our narratives, right? Because sometimes these narratives don't always fit with how things are, circumstances change, we need to be open to changing that. That'll be something that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. So, with the Hochschild example, we can see that we're kind of getting towards political narratives and the role that narratives have in our politics. And as we all know, politics is one of those things that people often don't talk about in their family, where it's one of those things that you just better left unsaid. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it is, for many people, a core part of their identity. It is part of their deep narrative of how they view the world and picture the world and so on. And I think, again, going back to that Nietzsche quote, it covers over a lot of fear. It explains a lot of the reasons that we have fear. It's often built on fear, and those fears often reinforce the narratives, and there's a kind of resistance to changing the narratives precisely because of the fear that would come with thinking outside the box, so to speak. So as a result of that, a change to one's sort of narrative or way of making sense of the world can often come across as a kind of self-threat. And there are multiple ways to respond to self-threats. One common way of responding to a self-threat is to compare yourself to someone who's clearly inferior, another who's clearly inferior. That will make yourself feel better. And so an example of that might be like conspiracy theories. It's where someone will go, all these other people who follow the mainstream story, they're dupes, they're simpletons. They don't have the real truth like I do. So that's a sense in which those can kind of reinforce a narrative without taking facts into consideration, which is the other thing about these narratives. These narratives are kind of a self-defense mechanism. They're a way of making sense of who we are. We want to have a sense of ourselves as coherent, as strong, as able, as adjusted. And these narratives that we have in terms of making sense of our lives, for the most part, do so without really taking into consideration a lot of the facts that come into play. And that's why there's lots of, I mean, if you've ever had the experience, so there's studies in this. If you get into an argument, let's say a red state person and a blue state person gets into an argument, and you bring to one or the other all these facts that undermine their argument, you would think that after the argument they're like, oh wow, maybe I need to rethink this. But usually they leave those arguments more convinced than before in what they were thinking. And so that just goes to show that truth questions, what is actually truth, what is actually the facts out there, aren't as important in some contexts like this. That what's relevant here is the sense of value and worth in oneself. And any threats to self are often protected even at the expense of facts. And so facts will often be ignored as a result of that. A consequence of this, as we all know, is we have an age of partisanship for many reasons. But I think one of the reasons, I mean, I'm not obviously the only one to say this, social media, the echo chambers of social media often reinforce our own narratives. So we don't have any encounters in a friendly, and I'll talk about this in a minute, in a friendly and safe context, encounters with difference, encounters with a contrasting viewpoint that might cause us to, without self-threat coming into the picture, the fear that comes in the picture, to open ourselves up to changing our minds. That doesn't happen in a lot of social media contexts because you don't get those different perspectives. You don't get those challenging viewpoints. A consequence of this is a lack of civil discourse. The other becomes more an enemy than someone to have a conversation with, someone to eliminate rather than to understand. And which leads me to the question, is there a role for philosophy in this context? And as you probably guessed, my answer is yes, there is a role for philosophy in this context. And so what is that role? I mean, I think that's what the last section of my talk here is what I call practicing dialogue. That picture up there is a painting, can't remember who painted it, but it's a painting of a coffee shop in early 1700s England. And there was an important phenomena in late 17th, early 18th century England that in coffee shops, people, mostly well-to-do people, but would go to coffee shops and have these long dialogues and conversations. Addison and Steele, famous Englishman who wrote The Spectator, which was a widely read magazine at the time, they would all meet in coffee shops. So coffee shop was kind of like their office, and they'd have heated conversations, but not too heated. The third Earl of Shaftesbury, who often went to these coffee shops and was mentored and advised by John Locke, claims that going to these sort of coffee shop environments that we could, as he puts it, we polish one another and rub off our corners and rough sides by a sort of amicable collision. To restrain this is inevitably to bring a rust upon men's understanding. So to understand things better, we need to encounter difference. We need to encounter challenges to our perspectives and views. And this sort of became a kind of practice of intellectuals and elites in the 18th century. The salon culture in France was one important example, but you had a number of societies in Scotland as well. And what I've argued in one of my other books is that the Scottish Enlightenment was in many ways largely a consequence of these types of salon cultures. And David Hume, who is pictured there, Jolly David as he was often known, was a key figure in that. So I get to please Bill talk more about David Hume. One of the things that Hume argues is that these kinds of encounters can extend our natural partiality. Right? Now, what Hume argues that the standard view was that we are by nature selfish. Hume argues that that's too simplistic a view of who we are. We are partial. What does that mean? We are partial to our own children as opposed to other children. We are partial to people who are like us. So we tend to hang out with people who share our values or who we can talk with or we've had good conversations with before. We're going to be more partial to returning to that kind of encounter in the future. We are less partial to people who are different. Again, back to that Nietzsche quote, people who are greatly different from us, strange, unfamiliar. We have a natural partiality against those types of encounters. What Hume argued that these kinds of gatherings, these salon cultures, improvement societies as they were known in Scotland, you were kind of put into a situation where you kind of are forced by sort of an unspoken code of conduct to be gentlemanly, to treat others kindly, to be open, respectful, and yet vigorous in the discussion, vigorous in the debates and in the dialogue. And what he argued is that these institutions such as these improvement societies, means of bringing people together to talk, and as he would argue, laws that protect free speech, laws for other forms of having dialogue that's open, all these, and one of Hume's own, which is kind of ironic, the biggest building at the University of Edinburgh campus, and some of you I know were on the Scotland program, is called David Hume Tower. David Hume never taught at the University of Edinburgh. He applied for a job there, but was denied because he was too religiously radical. They thought he was an atheist, and so he didn't get the job. And Hume's point was like, let's talk about this. Let's talk about what's going on here. Let's have open dialogue. And so he encountered the sort of barriers to this type of dialogue. So he was claiming that what's ultimately going to help us is if we have institutions and practices that support this kind of open dialogue where you can encounter differences and rub off the sharp corners where you get bristled when someone says something different and you become more amenable to listening to a different point of view. And the Select Society was the name of the society that Hume went to. And it was, they would get drunk or drink a lot. I guess that's the same thing. They would go drink a lot and play cards and try to solve all the world's problems. Okay? I'm say that half in jest, but they would sit around and they would bring up topics and discuss them. And it didn't really matter if they solved the world's problem. I think one of the pressures we have is to quickly solve things now, rather than just having kind of a conversation about it to see where things go. And I think that was a lot of what they had. A lot of the conversations probably didn't go anywhere, but I think it created a greater sense of community in the society at the time. So what I would argue is that, kind of wrapping up here, is that the sort of living in dialogue means, and that's a statue of Marcus Aurelius, he's a Stoic, and I'll explain why he's there in a second. It means that part of what our life entails is a kind of series of relevance questions that we can never fully answer, right? So it's not like, to go back to that apartment manager, it's not like the narrative that we create for ourselves finally answers the relevance questions to satisfaction. Those are never going to be answered to satisfaction because the answers we tend to come to expect are the truth question type answers, right? So one of the tensions in our life is the tension between the uncertainty of relevance questions and the motivation of these questions impress upon us, and the desire for a definitive answer. The types of answers that we look to science for. And I think that has played itself out in philosophy. In the last century, philosophy has often tried to become more like a science, like a form of logic, a form of helping as a tool to assist the sciences to become more clear in their work. And there's nothing wrong with that approach, but it looks over or it ignores the other half of what's going on in our life, these sort of relevance questions, which I think are important to what it means to live a meaningful life. And I think that goes back to the Stoics. I think one of the things that you find in ancient philosophy is that philosophy was a way of life. Philosophy is not like a class you take once a week, twice a week. It's not a theoretical discipline where you kind of sit on the... Descartes kind of gave that sort of, that iconic image of sitting in his chair by the fire, having these meditations and these doubts and so on. And so it's kind of led to this notion of philosophy as a kind of study, something you do in your study, and it doesn't have any role to play in the rest of your life. For most of the ancient philosophers, it was a way of life. And for instance, the ancient philosophers, they would have a beard. Most other people wouldn't have a beard, but a philosopher could have a beard. I don't know why. I don't know why. And this is a fairly new phenomenon for me. It's not because I'm a philosopher. But it is one of those things that philosophy was a way of life. And as one of the key premises of Stoic wisdom is that wisdom is scientific knowledge of the divine and the human, and that philosophy is practice of expertise and utility. So philosophy is always geared towards assisting us in life. Philosophy is always a practical discipline. It's something that have practical implication. And I think the relevance questions, as I've been talking about, are a way of bringing it back to our lives, right? Bringing it from the sort of, I don't know, the ivory towers of theory, the ivory towers of really hard texts to read. I would love to tell you to go read my books, but they might come across as too theoretical, too hard, because it presupposes a lot of stuff. But at bottom, what I'm really trying to say is that philosophy should be something that gets you to think about things differently, that it opens up avenues to think about the ways you make sense of the world, that you're able to see questions where you didn't see questions before. And so a way of thinking about it is that what we know and what we come to know is not the end of dialogue, it's not the goal, but it's really the beginning, right? We always start with where we think we know things, with what we take our meaning and purpose in life to be, but that's not the goal. The goal of living is one of being forever open to encountering that which we can't fully explain. And rather than trying to reduce it to just an unknowable thing that science will eventually discover, we need to see it as actually integral to who we are. And that's okay. It's okay to recognize that. And so if we think about our deep story, our deep narratives of how we make sense of our lives, kind of like Monet and his paintings, or me keep coming back to this question of what is philosophy, it should be something that we keep coming back to again and again and again. Kind of like Monet kept coming back to his pond in Giverny to keep painting his water lily paintings. Thank you. Thank you.